Breaking news right now of a potential that a nuclear meltdown could be happening right now in Japan. There has been fear throughout the day, in fact for a few days now, that there could be a nuclear meltdown, and we're receiving word now that that could be happening. Joining us now via broadband from Montreal is Gordon Edwards. He's with the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. What do you think of this news that there could be a meltdown happening right now, and what exactly is a meltdown?
Okay, two good questions. First of all, a meltdown is due to the fact that you cannot shut the reactor completely off, because even when it's shut down totally, there's still 200 megawatts of heat being generated just by the radioactivity alone, and nobody knows how to shut off radioactivity. So unless you keep cooling the core of the reactor for days after it's shut down, it's going to suffer an increase of temperature, which will eventually cause a melting of the fuel at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is more than twice the melting point of steel. And that means that not only is this going to melt down into the ground, literally, but it's also going to give off enormous quantities of radioactive gases, vapors, and solids, ash, into the atmosphere. Ultimately, whether it finds its way into the outer atmosphere is a question of whether the containment is damaged.
Is a meltdown a point of no return? Is there any way of recovering from that? What happens?
Chernobyl was an example of a complete meltdown, and 3 Mile Island is an example of a partial meltdown. Sometimes when it starts to melt, you might be able to arrest it, and I gather that that's what they're trying to do. They're pumping seawater not into the core of the reactor, but into the actual reactor building in an effort to drown the reactor and surround it by so much water that it won't actually reach that melting point. Already, however, there are indications that there has been some melting going on, because cesium and iodine have been released into the atmosphere, and we hear that there are 3 patients in a nearby hospital about 3 kilometers away who've already shown signs of radioactive contamination. So it's a dangerous situation for people around, especially young children and pregnant women.
Is seawater, in this case for cooling, is that considered a viable option? Does it work? And I guess that means that the internal system has completely broken down.
Yes, this is a problem with the reactor. They suffered a loss of electricity, of course, off-site electricity, but then they had 3 emergency generators which only functioned for less than an hour. Then they turned to a battery, but the battery only lasts for 4 hours. And the result is that they just weren't able to keep those pumps going. If you can't keep the pumps going, you can't cool the core, and the core is going to melt. So they're now pumping seawater in a desperate effort to try and just surround it with so much water that it needs to boil the water before it can proceed to a complete meltdown.
How far would people have to get away from a meltdown in order to be safe?
Well, as we've seen with Chernobyl, thousands of kilometers is the possible reach.
Wow.
Now, it depends which way the wind is blowing. If the wind is blowing over the ocean, that would certainly relieve a lot of the Japanese immediately from being exposed to it, and the Chinese. However, if the wind just shifts around, then you have a plume that goes, wherever the wind wants to take it. Right now, however, 20 kilometers is not nearly enough for young children and pregnant women. They represent the future generation. And the trouble is that radioactive material in their bodies can not only cause cancer, but it can cause mental retardation, it can cause stunted growth, it can cause a lot of other things. So they should be urging young children and pregnant women to get as far away as possible.
Gordon Edwards with the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, thank you very much. And because this is a developing situation, hopefully we can talk to you later on this evening if, in fact, Japan is facing a nuclear meltdown right now. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.